It's fantastic for building confidence, and I think it's great to hear students develop that confidence in speaking it in the classroom.
It's seeing the students talking to other students from other schools about things that they may not normally have engaged with on a day-to-day basis.
The opportunity to debate and also to think analytically and critically. I think this possibly puts it in a broader context and lets them think about the bigger picture as well.
As far as I'm concerned, debating at the moment is not an explicit part of our curriculum and our teaching and learning in the school. I hope it will become more of one because of the success we've had in this competition.
I just felt so much confidence that I knew what I was talking about and that these people would be willing to listen to me.
I've learned that if you want to be listened to and respected, then you should learn how to make your point come across.
This has created a real buzz at Thirsk School and Sixth Form College. I think that buzz would be desirable in any school in the country.
Good evening and welcome. I hope you enjoyed that video. It's so inspiring, and as chair of the board of the ESU, I'm hugely proud and honoured to support all our members and our volunteers and our hardworking staff in what is often life-changing work for young people through our speaking and debating and performance competitions and participative events. And most especially when they and all of us have new and extraordinary challenges in these difficult times. One of the new opportunities we've had is to develop these online events, linking us in new ways and to discuss aspects of the new challenges in building skills and confidence in communication among young people. Our series has addressed aspects of increasing inequalities and increasing incivilities and increasing discrimination against people, but also where greater discrimination is needed over the veracity of news and information. We've revisited the relationship, for example, between the message and the medium. For those of us who were with us in our series last year, well, you would have enjoyed a suggestive series of contributions, opening with a discussion, if you remember, of how civility might not be entirely negative, of the boundaries and constraints of robust debate, leading to redefinitions of what civility means and does. We addressed the debate about whether being uncivil extends to the expression of views that upsets others and the attempts to ban hate speech and the definition of what hate might be. And we then moved in our second session to the world of neuroscience, exploring whether by nature rather than nurture, some are born to be better and more civil speakers than others, about predisposition to argument, to opportunity or fear, and how what was called conflict approaching people are more likely to adopt uncivil strategies. And then in our pre-Christmas panel, we focused on our own work with young people and heard also from university classrooms about what the concept of debate now means to people, how it can be used positively to bring about compromise and resolution rather than simply conflict, but also how it intersects with the impact of changing media, of the relationship between civil speaking, debating, and testing assertions face to face when contrasted with anonymous and digitally conveyed misinformation and fake news. Our attention focused on civility in culturally diverse societies to enable citizens with very different beliefs and values and attitudes to live peacefully together, of civility providing what one of our speakers called a standard of conversational decorum, of how, as President Obama put it, of how to disagree without being disagreeable. Well, tonight we are thrilled to have as our speaker Professor Cheshire Calhoun, speaking to us from Phoenix, Arizona. I think Cheshire will be putting her camera on. Cheshire Calhoun is one of the most distinguished and exciting philosophers working in the United States today. She is CLAS Trustee Professor of Philosophy at Arizona State University and previously taught and researched at the College of Charleston, Colby College in Maine, the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and Princeton University. In 2014, she was elected as chair of the American Philosophical Association and in 2020 was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Cheshire's work embraces normative ethics, moral psychology, the philosophy of emotion, and feminist and gay and lesbian philosophy. A 2018 book is entitled Doing Valuable Time, The Present, the Future, and Meaningful Living. She is series editor for Oxford University Press's Studies in Feminist Philosophy, and the author of Feminism, the Family, and the Politics of the Closet, the editor of Setting the Moral Compass, Essays by Women Philosophers, and the co-editor, What is an Emotion? Classic Readings in Philosophical Psychology. And she's published articles on forgiveness, on integrity, shame, common decency, commitment, and civility. I note that she said that, to quote her, philosophical writing for me has always been a way of bringing some clarity to problems or questions that I find myself thinking about in daily life. And she writes that her set of essays, very recently republished under the title Moral Aims, Getting It Right and Practicing Morality with Others, was, to quote her, motivated by the desire to get clear about how critical reflection on what one ought to do is connected to the meaningful practice of morality in a social world where some forms of wrongdoing are conventionalized and where there are significant moral disagreements between people. That led me to take up such topics as civility, common decency, moral failure, and moral responsibility. Cheshire's kindly agreed to a question and answer session following her talk. So questions can be sent in as usual to Anthony, or voiced directly when I and then he open that part of this evening's meeting. But now it gives me great pleasure to ask Cheshire Calhoun to speak to us, to explore the importance and meaning of civility. Cheshire.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very lovely introduction. I am not going to tell you how to be civil. I'm probably not going to answer very hard questions about civility, but I want to give you a little primer on what I take civility to be and why it matters, and some ways of reflecting on how our norms of civility are constantly changing. So I'm going to begin by, I was going to share my slides, and I see that I cannot do that. Could the host enable my screen sharing, please? Okay. Well, then we will. I'm sorry, there seems to be a technical difficulty. So I'm going to go ahead and talk my way through this. I had hoped to begin by playing for you a little clip from our presidential debates that has incivility clearly on display. So I'll simply describe to you that debate. Sorry. So in that little clip, we have Joe Biden and Donald Trump engaged with each other, and Donald Trump simply will not stop talking during Joe Biden's
Cheshire, you might be able to try it again, I think we're hearing.
Okay, I apologize for this little difficulty. Yes, here we go. Great, I'm glad I can play this for you. Okay, so here we go.
The question is just as radical left. Will you shut up, man? Who is on your list, Joe? This is on your list. Gentlemen, I think this is so unprecedented. We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment. That was really a productive segment, wasn't it? Keep yapping, man. The people understand, Joe. 47 years you've done nothing. They understand. All right.
Okay, so you might have been making a little list in your head about what was an instance of incivility in this particular clip. So if I had to pick out my items for my list, obviously Trump's talking over Biden so that Biden could not be heard during his allowed time. But Biden's saying "shut up, man" and "keep yapping, man" would be on my list of incivilities. the facial expressions of disgust or contempt, and possibly Trump saying in 47 years, you've done nothing. And I hope I will return a little later to explain why I say just possibly that was uncivil. So what the clip invites us to think about, I think, is how do we pick out instances of incivility? That is, what do they have in common that mark them out as uncivil? And does what counts as incivility vary by context? So some of the things that you can say in the context of a political debate without being uncivil are not the sorts of things that you could say at a dinner party without being uncivil. Why do civil interactions matter? Why did it matter that the debate here be a civil debate? And finally, I think Biden's comments really raise the question for us of whether you can be justified in sometimes being uncivil because there's something more important at stake. And also whether people's behavior can be so egregiously bad that you simply don't owe them a civil response in the first place. And so you don't even have to justify incivility. Okay, so here's my little plan. I want to take you through some preliminaries first to remind you of the domain in which we talk about civility and incivility, and also say a little bit about the work that civility does for us. Then the main event is to give you an account of what civility is. So I'm going to be suggesting that civility always involves a communicative display of respect, toleration, considerateness, directed at someone, where the communication of our attitudes depends upon our having shared social norms for how to go about displaying these attitudes. With that definition in hand, I also want to remind you that our norms for civility vary by social context, and also that our norms are constantly changing. And I'll give you some examples. All right, at the very end, I want to take up the question that I think often we worry about, which is incivility ever justified? And finally, this very interesting question of, is it possible for people's behavior to be beyond the bounds of civility where civil response simply is not owed? Okay, so we can say that the domain of civility is social participation, or perhaps better, social interaction, where you have people largely face to face. And is social interaction that has a particular kind of character, namely where we are sharing social, physical, and conversational spaces, but not just with people who agree with us or who are behaving well, but in particular with people who have different values and views, some of which we're going to find obnoxious, who have different lifestyles, religions, or political affiliations, some of which we may disapprove of, who have their own feelings, interests, and desire for privacy in the context of these interactions. And these are people who are imperfect. All of us are, and who may do or see things that we find wrong-headed, disagreeable, offensive, rude, bossy, intrusive, inconsiderate, mean, and so on. All right, now, when we think about this sort of domain of social interaction, we can distinguish between sort of two different forms that civility takes. So some of our norms of civility are norms of what I call political civility. The clip I just showed is an instance where political incivility is in play, and the norms of political civility should have been abided by. So these are cases where we are engaging with other people on controversial issues and where we want to talk about what counts as civil or uncivil speech. But it's important not to think that civility is just about speech on controversial issues. So a huge domain of civility is concerned with polite civility, with not being rude or inconsiderate. So norms of polite civility regulate how we should respond to people in all of the social settings of everyday life where we come into contact with them. So when we're driving on highways and we might be tempted to flip people off, as I've occasionally done, I'm sad to say, or in grocery lines, or at funerals, or at parties, or in neighborhood interactions. Now, some of these norms of civility obviously are codified. So if you're in a presidential debate, there are formal rules. So each of the debaters in the presidential debate was supposed to have 2 minutes of uninterrupted time. We also have some laws in the US. Many areas, or most areas, have laws that prohibit people from playing loud music late at night in a way that would disturb their neighbors. But most of the norms of civility are not codified, but rather they exist as shared social understanding. So we have a sort of sense for what the rules are of how to be civil or how to be uncivil. So what work do civility norms do? Well, most obviously, they operate as a kind of constraint, right? So in some cases, they actually prohibit us from saying certain things. For example, using racial slurs. They sometimes prohibit us from certain kinds of actions that would be highly disrespectful to other people. But in most of the cases, the norms of civility simply place some kinds of limits on the manner in which we express ourselves, the form that our actions take, or this acceptable place that our actions take. So just so you have a sense of these constraints, I'm going to give you some examples. So we take it that civility norms place constraints on the kind of curiosity you can express about other people. So asking other people, how much do you weigh? Or asking someone who's in a wheelchair, what's it like to be paralyzed, would count as an intrusive kind of curiosity about people's lives and count as uncivil. Certain kinds of helpfulness are also uncivil. They are intrusive, and civility norms constrain some forms of helpfulness. So for example, simply grabbing the handles on someone's wheelchair and pushing them along when they haven't asked you is an intrusive kind of helpfulness. Many civility norms constrain the expression of your negative attitudes and negative assessments of other people. So you may privately think all sorts of horrible things about other people, but civility norms require you to keep those to yourself. Many civility norms will also constrain what topics you can bring up in various kinds of contexts, of what topics you are allowed to bring up if you're at the dinner table. They're not the same kind of topics as you're allowed to bring up in a political debate. And they also constrain the forms of address. So in the clip I gave, where Joe Biden says, quit yapping, man. I take it the use of man is uncivil, right? It's a disrespectful form of address that would be constrained by civility norms. But civility norms don't just constrain, they also encourage us to offer these positive tokens of respect. So when you call your physician Dr. So-and-so, or when you refer to a leader as President so-and-so, you're offering a little positive token of respect. They ask us also to give positive tokens of consideration and toleration. So when you thank people for gifts, you are giving that little positive token of consideration for the kindness of someone else. Now, together, these constraining and encouraging functions of civility, what they enable us to do is to publicly recognize all the people we interact with as having equal basic moral worth as social participants, no matter how we might privately appraise them as individuals. Okay, so what's the net result of all of these constraints and encouragements? The result is the willing participation of very different people in social life and in all the venues of social life. So you can think about this, how you think about joining various groups, how you think maybe about joining a social media chat group. So you ask yourself, do I want to be involved with these people? And the answer might be no. If you think that these people are not able to show you that they respect you, that they're considerate of your interests and your feelings, and that they are willing to tolerate your different views. The reverse is also true. right? When you have a group who's thinking about, do we want this person to join us? They're going to ask themselves, well, is this the kind of person who's capable of civil interaction with us? Okay, so now I come to what civility is. So I'm going to propose this, that the function of civility is always to communicate. So we're doing something that's morally good when we're being civil, but we're doing something different than we do in most other instances of moral behavior. We're concerned not with primarily or just with how we treat other people, but we're particularly concerned with what it is we are communicating to other people by what we do and what we say. And we are concerned with communicating these basic moral attitudes of respect, toleration, and considerateness. Now, how are we able to do this? How can we communicate to other people that we respect them, or that we tolerate them, or we communicate them? Well, all communication relies on there being a shared language. So the shared language that we need in order to communicate these important moral attitudes is provided by our having social norms that are norms of civility, and they specify which actions and verbal expressions counts as displays of respect and so on, and which count as displays of disrespect. So here's the little account. Civility is the display. This is what I want to focus on. Interpersonal interaction is the display to somebody else of respect, tolerance, and considerateness by means of socially shared norms for doing so. Now, I want to be clear about this. There are lots of ways in which we can be disrespectful of other people without being uncivil. So you imagine, you know, a racist conversation among fellow racists is disrespectful of the racial group that they are heaping contempt on. But it's not uncivil because it's not a display to the targets of disrespect that they are being disrespected. Okay, now, you remember at the very beginning when I said, oh, I wasn't sure if Donald Trump saying, in 47 years, you've done nothing, counted as incivility. And that's because I wasn't quite confident. I fully grasp what the norms of civility for political debates are. So it certainly would be the case that if you were sitting around the dinner party and you said to your parents or a neighbor or some other fellow at the dinner party, oh, in 47 years, you've done nothing. That would clearly be uncivil. And it would disrupt the function of that particular event. But presidential debates are very different, right? They don't have the function of being pleasant occasions for socializing. They have the function of airing differences and criticisms. And so saying in 47 years you've done nothing might in fact not be uncivil within that context. Now think again of other contexts in which we can be civil or uncivil. Just standing in line shopping is an occasion for displaying civility or incivility. So if you crowd other people, if you peer over into their carts and make comments, particularly negative comments on what they're purchasing, you're engaging in kind of an intrusion into their privacy and showing a lack of consideration for their privacy that counts as being uncivil. Now take this instance of funerals, right? We have very stringent rules for what counts as civility in the context of a funeral, one of whose main aims is to show respect for the dead and for the family of the dead. And so there are very strong constraints on what you can do, what you can say, what you can wear, how you can move, and so on. So if we're worried about whether, we are being civil or uncivil, we have to pay attention to the context we are in and to think about what are the norms of civility that are operative in this context. Now, I talked as though, the norms of civility are just this, set of norms that never change, but that's certainly not true. Because they are social norms, because we are constantly interacting with each other, we're also constantly renegotiating what those norms are. So here are 3 examples of areas where I think we are presently in the midst of renegotiating what the norms of civility are. So this first picture is, I'm sorry to say, a picture of John C. Calhoun, to whom I am very remotely related. He was a very famous senator in the Civil War era, a champion of slavery. This statue was in Charleston, South Carolina. It has since been removed. Now, until just recently, having such statues might have in fact been, truly in fact was, disrespectful to all those who continue to suffer the legacy of American slavery and whose ancestors might have been enslaved. But those statues were not interpreted as a display of disrespect. That is, our social norms did not interpret these as communicating disrespect. We're now in in an era where we can see that such statues do communicate disrespect and are able to see them as targeted at a disesteemed population. Here's another case where I think we are in the midst of negotiating or renegotiating our norms of civility. And it has to do with the use of gender pronouns for those who are transgendered. Now, up until just recently, norms of civility, basically said you are being civil as long as your pronoun use tracks the person's sex at birth, right? We now are beginning to think, no, that's not right. It isn't. We're able now to interpret the misgendering of trans people as communicating disrespect, not just being disrespectful, but actually communicating by means of a shared language which says these are disrespectful behaviors. This last case, I think, we're still in a point of evolution on it, certainly in the United States. So it's the case of mask wearing. So at the beginning of the pandemic, some people wore masks, some people didn't. Whether we did or didn't really communicate much of a message. In areas where masks have been mandated for some period of time, I think we are now able to see individuals who enter stores where they are required to wear masks, but who refuse to do so, as not just being inconsiderate, but as being uncivil, right? So we're able to see non-mask wearing as a communicative gesture that communicates lack of consideration for other people's health. All right, so let me turn to the very last thing because I want to get us to the Q&A. A question that, we all have to ask ourselves is, can I be uncivil to that form of behavior? Isn't it, such terrible behavior, such obnoxious behavior and so on? Can I be uncivil to it? And, Miss Manners in her little guide, Citizen's Guide to Civility, which I recommend that you read, she, lists all of these people's narratives of atrocious behavior who write to her and say, oh, well, can't I be uncivil to that? Do I still have to make nice? So I want to give you reason to be very cautious about jumping to the conclusion that you can be uncivil to bad behavior. So remember that the whole point, the whole function of civility norms is to keep us interacting, is enable us to keep interacting, even when we disagree, we behave badly, and so on. But there are cases where I think, if you think carefully, you might think, listen, there's something so important at stake here. I'm justified in being uncivil. So Joe Biden might have thought to himself, listen, there's something so important at stake in this presidential debate that I'm justified in being uncivil by saying, just shut up, man. But it's important here that we don't trivialize the importance of civility norms and take ourselves to be sort of justified whenever we happen to think that we're right. Then there's this interesting case where it got me to start thinking about civility in the first place, where people's behavior is just so bad. And I think, I didn't even owe them a civil response in the first place, right? What they've done has put them beyond the bounds of civility. But then the question is, it's like, how do you determine that? How do you determine when individuals have gone beyond the bounds of civility and now you don't even owe them a civil response? You can, it's a free-for-all now. Well, the answer can't be, this is that you are to use your own judgment. Because remember, the norms of civility are supposed to help us interact when we disagree on things, and including things about where the bounds of civility are set, what behavior is so egregiously bad. So I want to suggest that the bounds of civility are set in the same way that the rules of civility are, namely by a kind of shared social understanding or shared consensus. So we now have, I hope, shared social understandings that any defense of slavery is beyond the bounds of civility and you don't owe it a civil response. But there are many forms of misbehavior where we don't have completely shared social understandings, that these are beyond the bounds of civility, and then you are still required to try to make nice. Okay, so that is my little, let me stop the share so I can see you all and you can see me. All right, I'd be happy to take questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to unmute myself. Hello. Sorry, I was a slight technical problem there. I think thank you so much for that fascinating, absolutely fascinating talk. Can I start off, Cheshire, by actually picking up where we sort of left it, because I'm really fascinated by sort of misinterpretation here, misinterpretation of norms. Yeah. So we have these social norms, which as you were saying, are operative in very specific contexts, and as you were saying, are changing all the time in a fascinating and sometimes challenging way. Yeah. And there can be contexts, I'm thinking, going back to our young people speaking publicly, sometimes for the first time, where they operate with rules and where there might be a chairman who can intervene with rules. Or we might also think of the Senate or the House of Commons, yeah, where the speaker will actually say, no, that's rude language, that's offensive language, and ask for a retraction. That seems clear enough. And there are also big issues, as you were saying, where change is apparent, such as the issue of slavery and that you were just talking about. But interpreting sort of nuance seems to me to be really crucial here, and how we actually interpret small things. So if I take you back, for example, to the debate, I was really interested. Part of, at one point you said, and this is really pertinent to the ESU, you were saying we have a shared language here, or a shared language in certain ways. I was very interested in your interpretation, for example, in a very small way of Joe Biden using the word man. Now, I had taken that as uncivil. That hadn't registered to me that had any meaning that might be pejorative in any way. I took it as perhaps something that was an equivalent of the English mate rather than man, and I was one. So there was an issue of interpretation. And if just also on that, I do wonder whether the issue of gender intervenes here a little bit as well in terms of misinterpretation too. Could I give you one small example on that? Mm-hmm. Example with Kamala Harris, I was fascinated in the vice presidential debate about her technique of saying, I'm speaking, yes, and smiling in a very particular way, which is probably quite that is I think, as we've come to know her as in seeing her on many occasions. But when I first saw that, one wondered, is that a particular type of artifice? Is it a debating technique? Is it stretching? How are we to interpret those moments? Now, they're two very small examples, but I'm wondering about the interpretation that one has to adopt here.
Yeah, okay, so I have a variety of things. Let me take the last example first, that, where she says I'm speaking. So, when people behave badly, and don't show sufficient respect, you know, interrupt you and so on. Civility norms typically don't prevent us entirely from correcting the other person or standing up for ourselves. So I take it, you know, I'm speaking is, you know, is fine. You know, it's a civil way of, you know, just noting this is the rule. You know, I'm just reminding you of it. It's quite different from saying, just shut up. Which it does show a complete lack of toleration for what the other person is doing. So one of the really tricky things when we're thinking about, you know, being civil is, how can I go about objecting to or protesting or correcting somebody else, but without violating the norms of civility? And that takes a great deal of delicacy. So I sort of admire her her way of doing it. Yeah, so interpretation, you know, it hadn't occurred to me that you all would not hear man the way I hear man. No, it is very disrespectful in that context where, you know, you're just saying, you know, it's like, just shut up, Joe Blow. You know, it's not a friendly thing to say. It's a demeaning thing to say. So yeah, there was no way around. He was being uncivil. I thought you were going to say that you didn't hear us as uncivil because many of us might not have, just because we thought he was justified. Right. So that's why I want to draw this distinction between being civil and being uncivil in a justified way, so that we can, you know, keep that straight. Well, do you want me to? I had another point, but maybe you want to get some other people.
No,
in?
that's really interesting. I can see the screen flashing with things. I'm going to hand over to Anthony, who will direct us to the next questioner. Thank you.
Thank you, James. We have a couple of ways that you can ask questions today. I notice a couple of you have been putting things in the chat window. Actually, that's not a great way to get a question to us. What we'd really like you to do is, if you do want to type it in, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you can specifically type questions in there and one of us will read them out for you. But we'd much rather hear from you or even see you. So you'll see that there's a raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen as well. If you raise your hand, then I can open up your microphone and if you're willing, your camera as well, so that we can hear and see you. So let's just give it a moment. We have one question coming in. Would you like to read it out, James, or would you like me to?
I can't see it, unfortunately.
Okay.
Go.
Got a written question coming in from Ursula, who says, unfortunately, in philosophy, many female philosophers have to say, "I'm speaking," to get their voice heard. So what could Joe Biden have done differently?
Oh. So what could Biden have been done differently? In his particular case, I don't know that he could have done anything differently. I mean, the moderator was unable to control the situation. You know, Biden wasn't effective in controlling it either. So, you know, the alternative would have been not to be uncivil, but just to be absolutely silent and just, you know, wait this guy out and hope the moderator intervened. But, you know, I personally think that this was a case where, because there was something a great deal more important at stake than being polite, that he was justified in being polite. But I want to come back to this comment that, you know, women often have to say, "I'm speaking," in order to be heard in certain kinds of social contexts. So I think, you know, one of the things that this brings out is that our social norms permit a kind of gendered disrespectfulness And it means our gender norms our civility norms are not perfect. So they permit speaking over women as not being as uncivil as speaking over men. And this is why we need to continue to negotiate what the civility norms should be, And I take it Harris, by continually saying I'm speaking, is a way of saying we need to readjust the civility norm in this context so that we are able to see that talking over women is just as disrespectful as talking over men.
Okay, I think Sarah Hawkins has a question she'd like to ask. Sarah, if you want to turn your camera on so we can see you.
Hello, thank you, Cheshire. That was very interesting. I was wondering, in Joe Biden's inauguration speech, he talked about civility in terms of religion. I wondered if religion also provides a sort of civil creed, as well as the sort of shifting social framework.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the content of what he said?
So he talked about an uncivil religion and civility being measurable as a sort of a truth, a religious truth.
Oh. Civility is a kind of, I guess I actually don't understand that.
So that religion was offering those norms about how we would behave with one another, rather than shifting social norms, providing that framework.
I don't think that works.
Right.
Right. I mean, because we are not all members of the same religion. But it is true that, people of different faiths are participants in this conversation about what our shared social understandings should be. It might be particularly important participants as, reflecting sort of a morally committed group of people. But I do think that norms of civility have to be shared understandings. They are not understandings set by one particular group. Now, that said, there is a place for experts on civility who help us to set and reset. So Judith Martin, Miss Manners. I take these, etiquette experts as playing actually a pretty important role in helping us to get clear on what the social norms are, and maybe also in helping to push along shared understandings of civility so that they are more progressive. Yeah, it's interesting.
Lots of questions coming in on the chat here, folks. We've got one from Erin Young says, is civility a kind of restriction for our words in the way that the law restricts our actions? Does it regulate morality and restrain the worst in people by social rather than legal pressure? What is the difference?
Yeah. It's a very good question. So I do think that we should think of civility norms on analogy with the law, and there are a lot of points of analogy. So both, the law, the legal system, as well as shared norms of civility are aimed at enabling a whole group of very diverse and disagreeing people to continue to interact with each other. So that's one point of commonality. Another point of commonality is that there is a point to abiding by the law, and there is a point to abiding by whatever the civility norms are. Even if some of those laws are bad or unjust laws, and even if some of the civility norms are criticizable for not being sufficiently reflective of the equal status, social status of all persons. And the reason why there's a point to doing that is because without a shared system of laws or without a shared system of norms, social norms for civility, you cannot hope to sustain interaction and participation, willing participation by a group of very diverse peoples. So I've lost now I'm not sure, did I respond to it? I don't see the chat comment now. Did I fully respond to that?
You'll see it in the answered questions on the panel there, but we've got lots of questions, so let's move on and take one from Richard. Richard Brown has said, do you think incivility is on the increase, or is it just a perception because the methods of communication are changing?
Yeah. Offhand, I'm inclined to say, well, it's hard to know, So I guess I would say I'm of two minds. I think there are certain domains in which incivility is increasing. So obviously within social media, where you have the problem of, flaming, where individuals are, and this is a good example of why you don't want the bounds of civility set by individuals. It's got to be by social consensus. So, you have, social media conversations where individuals are just deciding totally on their own what sorts of statements or views are beyond the bounds of civility, and then they engage in sort of flaming. So, I mean, that is problematic. And why it's particularly happening on social media isn't entirely clear, but it could be because we're out of the face-to-face accountability situation. But, on the hopeful end of things, I think we're making an enormous amount of social progress. So I think, the fact that we are now taking down those Civil War statues, that we are now paying attention to the way in which misgendering sends messages of disrespect. I mean, there are all these more socially progressive ways in which I think we are becoming more civil because we are developing better norms of civility. Yeah.
Okay. I see a hand raised from Stephen O'Kane. Stephen, if I bring you to the panel, would you like to ask your question live? Stephen, you may need to unmute yourself and turn your camera on.
Yeah. Perhaps. Oh God, I'm muted now.
No, we can hear. Oh, we heard him, and we've lost him. Stephen, can you hear us? You are on mute at the moment.
I've tried to.
We can hear you now.
Now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Ask your question.
All right. I'm sorry, I was getting confused with the messages. I do apologise. Yeah, firstly, I thought that it occurred to me that, of course, sometimes incivility is deliberate as a way of intimidating or threatening people, and that's happening on social media, I think. But also, in the past, especially in the days when norms of civility had more class associations than they have today, sometimes being uncivil was actually a deliberate protest, a deliberate attack on it. And we, of course, that in a way perhaps that almost confirms your notion that it's their shared social norms that determine what they are, because it's usually, in fact, groups that are changing them when they change. I'm sorry, I don't know whether that's really a question or an observation, but I thought there was some.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good observation. So, that we can, people can be deliberately uncivil as a means of intimidation or, asserting their power I think is absolutely right. So, once we have the shared language, and it's the shared language both of what, speech and behavior communicates respect, it's also a shared language for what speech and so speech and action you can use to communicate disrespect or intoleration or inconsiderateness. So that, when you have that kind of language, it can be used as a kind of weapon.
Okay.
To show, who you don't want to associate with. And certainly incivility can be a form of protest. I mean, it's one of the sad things is that sometimes perfectly legitimate protest gets construed as incivility. So, here's an example that I use, in my essay on civility. Is you think back to when sexual harassment wasn't really recognized as sexual harassment. It was just, thought of as kind of innocent, flirting or whatever. So that it didn't violate norms of civility. It wasn't taken as communicating disrespect. What did communicate disrespect was when women protested against it and said, you are behaving terribly badly. So protests themselves can be interpreted as instances of incivility, and quite unfortunately so, if our norms haven't progressed sufficiently.
Okay, we've got another hand up from Birgit Vern. Birgit, would you like to turn on your microphone? You'll need to unmute, Birgit. You're showing as muted. No. Okay, well, we'll move on. We have a question that's been typed in. Darren asks how civility can be used as a tool to oil the wheels in a debate between people with differing views.
Sure. And by oil the wheels, I take it means sort of facilitate the conversation and its productiveness. So, I mean, you'll remember that I said that, civility norms operate not just as a constraint, right? They tell us like, don't do that because it would communicate disrespect or consideration. But civility norms also tell us how we can offer these tokens of that positive tokens of respect or toleration or considerateness. So there are all sorts of ways in the context of a disagreement with other people to indicate to other people that you are nevertheless still interested in their view, that you nevertheless, you disagree, but you could see how a reasonable person might come to hold that view. So one way in which we can, use our civility norms is to, keep reinforcing for other people the idea that we really do see them as an appropriate terminus of social interaction. Yeah, so they do feel respected in that context.
Conscious of the time, I think we can take perhaps two more questions. I've got one slightly heavyweight one first, and then perhaps a slightly more light-hearted one to end on. So first, let's take a question written in here by Pia, who says, how does civility work in terms of civil society activism? If people want to protest against a corrupt government that is using dirty tricks against activists, what are the boundaries and where do activists lose their ground gained?
That's such an important question. I don't know that I have anything helpful to say, but I do have a couple things. So what activists want to do is not to impose change on other people, but rather to produce agreement to change. So there is going to be a place for trying to engage in protest in a way that still acknowledges an interest in continued social interaction and participation with the very people who you might be the greatest offenders. So I do think there's a place for that. But then, you have to go back to, the question of, is incivility ever justified? In a lot of activist movements, right, are highly committed to important moral or political values. And if there's a sense that we cannot move forward on these important values by continuing to observe the norms of civility, then that might be a case in which you're perfectly justified in being uncivil. I mean, this is very similar to the case of civil disobedience, right? So you want, so far as possible, to obey the law, because that signals that you view all fellow citizens as, fellow participants, and you want to sort of respect the, shared system of law that enables you to cooperatively work together. But there's a limit to that. It may be necessary to break the law in order to bring greater progress socially. But this is very tricky. I mean, the insurrectionists at the Capitol thought that they were justified in being uncivil. And that's why one has to be very careful in sort of taking the civility law into one's own hands. Yeah.
Okay, let's end with a nice simple one for you. Probably one of the types of incivility that winds most of us up at some point during the day. How would you deal with people using mobile phones in social situations when it's really not necessary?
Well, are they being uncivil? I don't think we have, I don't think we have a shared social norm that takes that to be a display of disrespect. Now, I do think it is disrespectful and inconsiderate. That's true. But I don't think we have a social norm that says, you can't do that it would be a display of disrespect. So, I mean, this is maybe a place where we really need to make some progress on our civility norms. Use of cell phones. Yeah. Great.
Well, apologies to all those of you we haven't got time for, but thank you to those of you who did put all your questions in. And James, I'll hand back to you to wrap up tonight's session.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you again for all those questions. But above all, thank you, Cheshire. We've worked you very hard. And I think I can speak on behalf of everyone. Not that we can see everyone, and that in itself is an issue, I think, that is very interesting in the way in which these online discussions work. That we can't see the audience out there in order to sort of interact. That itself is perhaps a mode of behaviour that we are, or a practice that we are. That challenges us. But I think I can speak on behalf of everyone in saying that you've actually shown us why you are so fascinated in this, and you've made some things which are so complicated and subtle really wonderful and revealing for us. So thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground over very, very complex, difficult issues. And I certainly leave this evening in an optimistic vein, because I think you've moved the debate that we've had about what civility and incivility is in a way which is very forward-looking and very progressive, and shows how those boundaries move society forward in a way which make us all interact with each other in a way which makes us a more civil society and better people for it. So thank you so much indeed. And thank you again for everyone else here for being with us tonight. And I also have to say on behalf of the ESU for thanking you for making your donation as well. And I also want to say, if you're not a member of the ESU, then do please think about joining us by being here tonight. You share our values. Like us, you believe that oral communication and cultural understanding are key to personal fulfillment, the shared language that we've just been hearing about, and lasting social change. So please do join us in working with young people all over the world, especially the less advantaged, in order to increase communication skills and cultural understanding. But now, again, a sincere thank you to Professor Calhoun and to you all out there for listening and participating. So thank you and good night or good day, depending on where you are.
Thank you.